Hello and happy holidays, everybody. This is Mike Moretti, a Hinsdale South High School AP US history teacher. And I thought I'd make this video to give some sense of what is it that we actually do in US history when we teach from with a racial lens, okay? There have been a lot of questions, I think, floating out there about like, what do we bring into US history that includes viewing things from perspectives other than kind of the standard dominant white culture perspective. I know that there's a lot of talk about how history books are written, and this is very accurate. It's important that you understand that as I explained to you what I do in AP US history, and again, I cannot speak for the other AP US history teachers, but they are definitely doing similar things. I want to give you a sense of what we do at Hinsdale South, or at least what I do, to bring more perspective to US history other than what might be out there in the books, okay? That's kind of why I'm creating this video, to give a sense of what I do in AP US history. And it's important for you guys to remember that this is an advanced placement US history. This is a survey class, right? I've got my notes here to help me, so forgive me if I look at them. But this is not a cultural studies class. This is not an African American history class. This is a survey course of the United States history that is intended to provide advanced placement credit. It's academic, it's taught as a college class, but it's also taught swiftly. Like, I don't have a ton of time to spend on any one subject. And so it is also important for you guys to realize out there that using a racial lens is one of many that I use in this class, right? I want to make sure that different groups are represented throughout my curriculum. Women, immigrants, Native Americans, Black Americans in this case is what I'm focusing on. Different groups, as well as the political theories, economics. I mean, there's a lot that goes into teaching AP US history beyond using just a racial lens. But that's what we're focusing on so that you can see how this class really does try and give a lot of perspectives on the history of this nation and not just the dominant white perspective, okay? So I'm gonna just kind of run us through what my curriculum looks like each year, okay? So the first period is colonial and revolutionary period. So let me kind of do this. Okay, so when we're looking at the time periods here that are fairly typical to teaching US history, we've got colonial and revolutionary period, okay? And that's a period where we talk about, European settlement to the New World. Along with that, the transatlantic slave trade. And we discuss, in my class, we discussed how slavery becomes racialized. This is like a chattel slavery. Again, this is different from, say, slavery as it existed in the Greek and Roman Empire or in North Africa and places like that. This is where it kind of changes in terms of its intent and what it's trying to accomplish, I should say. Along with this, we discussed the Barbados slave codes, which kind of ingrain this and make it a racial issue, particularly using people from Africa as labor. I show excerpts from Amistad, and along with that goes the slave result on the ship Amistad as Black people resist this, all right? And it's important that those voices are in there. But this gives you an idea in early US history and colonial times. And then this also brings us to like the Puritans and the Christianization that they are going to attempt in settling the New World, particularly with the way that they're going to view it as kind of assimilationism. We take a look at specifically at Phyllis Wheatley and her poetry and how it reflects this kind of white Christian assimilationism. in Kendi's book, and I'm not a personal fan of Kendi, but he refers to it as uplift suasion, which is basically assimilationism. It's kind of white Puritans say, "Well, these black people from Africa, they could be all right as long as we teach them to be like us, and we Christianize them, and which is kind of synonymous with this. And we take a look at Wheatley's poetry and how that kind of like fits into that dynamic. So part of that is got to do with the First Great Awakening, and it's tied into that as well. So this is the colonial period. Remember, I'm trying to go fast here, so I don't have any excerpts from lessons to give you and stuff. If you want to ask me about those later, you can. Meanwhile, we've got the writing of the Constitution itself after the American Revolution, and including elements such as the Fugitive Slave Act, the Three-Fifths Compromise, all of which are racist components to our Constitution, meant to protect slavery, and not to mention to be honest with the Electoral College and how that was meant to kind of kowtow to Southern voices on the issue because of slavery as well. So all of that is definitely discussed, and we take a look at, therefore, how revolutionary is the revolution in terms of changing the minds of the people that did this, right? The middle class, kind of white founding fathers, and what was protected, okay? And that's part of our dynamic in our discussion here. Meanwhile, in the northern states, I talk about how there's a gradual manumission of slavery in the northern states. We talk a lot about economic development, how slavery particularly develops in the South because of the economic difference, okay? And so the role of Black Americans at this point, you've got some free Black Americans in the North, some of which can even vote in certain states early on, like places like Pennsylvania, okay? But how that starts to develop differently due to the way the Constitution is written, the protection of slavery, et cetera, okay? Then we've got the antebellum period. So if I go back to my whiteboard here, okay? So we got the antebellum period, which basically encompasses from after the War of 1812 all the way up until the Civil War. I do just talk about the lines of the Star-Spangled Banner when it comes to the War of 1812. We discuss about which lines are omitted, particularly the racist ones that were tagged onto that. And again, this is creating nationalism in this country after the War of 1812, but for whom, right? And who's supposed to kind of really benefit from this? And that definitely comes into our picture. But in the antebellum South, again, I'm just giving you a quick overview. We talk about the feudalistic nature of it, using Black Americans as slaves to prop up kind of the economic system of the South. But that a culture develops amongst Black Americans, blending unique styles of music and language and things like that, that is a result of all of this, as well as the various voices of resistance against slavery that start to develop in the South from Black people, right? Notably, Denmark Vesey and his rebellion, David Walker and his appeal to the colored peoples of the world. I actually excerpt that. We read some of it. I want to keep in mind that a lot of these voices a lot of these non-white voices are also excerpted in primary sources that we use. Meanwhile, there is Nat Turner's Rebellion, a one that I spend considerable amount of time on in discussing what kind of the white reaction to that and how it's typically to kind of clamp down even further on the laws governing slavery. During this time period, the antebellum period, there's also Irish and German immigration, and we spend considerable time talking about the interplay between immigrants coming in and Black Americans and how they kind of fight each other in the pecking order for society, for the jobs that are there, for recognition. And it is an ongoing process between immigrants and the Black population in this country, okay? We do a reading on it that I give that is an academic source. It's a secondary source reading discussing this. And that is an ongoing thread because as more immigrants come in later, we continue to discuss that interplay between the groups. Meanwhile, in defense of slavery, we take a look at paternalism on the southern side and how they're going to claim that it's kind of good to do this and it's for the benefit of Black Americans. And it's known as paternalism. And I actually give an excerpt from Southern, what we call plantation literature, that was meant to go against the famous Uncle Tom's Cabin that is referred to as Aunt Phyllis's Cabin. And we take a look at those arguments that Southern whites use and we kind of critically assess them. But at the same time, we contrast that with abolitionism, but particularly the Black voices of abolitionism. Harriet Tubman, is somebody everybody knows, but also, the famous "Ain't I a Woman" speech. We take a look at that. And the impact that has Sojourner Truth, and specifically the challenges of being a Black female in slavery and what those challenges are, and voices against it. Frederick Douglass, of course, is the big one, who is the famous Black voice of abolitionism. And we read an excerpt from his autobiography, and we really contrast what he says versus what Southerners say about this practice, okay? And then, of course, there's all the rising conflict that has to do with the issue over slavery as we lead into the Civil War, manifest destiny, westward migration of this nation. We discuss about how the desire for Southerners to bring slavery out west, the debates over that, the various compromises, kind of culminating in the Dred Scott decision, where the Supreme Court hands down a very racist decision, essentially declaring that all Black Americans are slaves no matter what, and the impact that has for the Civil War that is coming over this issue, which we talk about how the Civil War begins as a fight over states' rights, if you will. It's really more, I talk about it as a fight over like keeping the Union together that develops into a fight over slavery as time goes, right? And why that is. During the Civil War itself, I definitely include the role of Black Americans in fighting in the Civil War. I put special highlight on that. The 54th Massachusetts, a guy named William Carney, who is the first Black American to receive the Medal of Honor for valor in combat, as well as the Emancipation Proclamations, problems that exist with that, and why it was issued and why it wasn't issued. So in the Civil War itself, these things come up, all right, and the Reconstruction period. So I'm now with Civil War and Reconstruction. Sorry, I probably should add that to And it's in this period that we with the closing of the Civil War, we asked the all-important question is, how successful was the United States government, and particularly the dominating radical Republicans, most of whom were white, right? How successful were they at meeting the needs of newly freed Black Americans, all right, called freedmen? And we really dive into that, and the mostly failures of Reconstruction when it comes to the development of Jim Crow laws in the South, voter suppression, the rise of what we call the New South, which I like to describe as same as the Old South, but minus slavery, but with as close as they could come up with, with segregation and Jim Crow laws and the Klan, the famous Plessy v. Ferguson decision by the Supreme Court that essentially protects segregationism in the South, and really in 1877 about how white Americans, particularly Republicans in the North, give up on equality for Black people in the South with the Compromise of 1877. Again, I'm not going to teach about it here, but it was essentially a trade-off of the presidency selling out Black Americans to segregationism for the next several decades. All right, the development of historically Black colleges, why they developed in the South, especially, and their ties to the Morrill Act. And in order to get federal money for colleges in the South, Southerners had to concede something. they would not concede on the segregation issue, so they allowed for the development of black colleges in the South as their way to get federal money for higher education, and Tuskegee Institute, et cetera, et cetera. That brings us to the Progressive Era and through the 1920s. Okay, and again, this is a brief overview. I'm just trying to give you an idea. Okay, in case you're needing to get your breath here. The Progressive Era through the 1920s, this is a period where you see no real help. We discuss how, despite all these progressive reforms that come out, not a lot is being done in terms of segregation, in terms of like the terrible treatment of the black community that's still going on during the Progressive Era. Where Teddy Roosevelt particularly fails on this, Woodrow Wilson, who is a straight up racist in the White House, the film Birth of a Nation that comes out during this time that essentially glorifies the Klan and white supremacy, and how Woodrow Wilson like has a personal screening for it. These are all things that we bring into how is that going to affect, therefore, presidents who are trying to make changes to America at this time or have a role in that change. But we also have black voices from the Progressive Era, like Booker T. Washington, like W.B. Du Bois, like Marcus Garvey and his Pan-Africanism and his Universal Negro Improvement Association. And we like compare and contrast these voices as voices for how this nation should move going forward, right? And so this is all part of the Progressive Era. World War I, what we call the Great Migration of Black Americans who start moving north during World War I, and the problems that causes in terms of like conflicts in the North, Black Americans fighting in segregated units, notably the Harlem Hellfighters. I talk about them specifically. The hypocrisy of self-determination of the United States. We want the world to be a better place, and Woodrow Wilson and his Treaty of Versailles, self-determination, but at the same time, the fact that Black people in the United States don't even have self-determination. So there's kind of the who is this self-determination meant for? And of course, there's a tie into the women's movement there as well. So the race riots that happened as a result of the Black migration north, notably Chicago in 1919. And then that brings us to the 1920s, the Harlem Renaissance, Langston Hughes, Louis Armstrong as examples we specifically look at. I show a documentary series that includes Black historians speaking about the Harlem Renaissance, right? Voices of people that were there as well and what they experienced through it. The introduction of jazz music as a uniquely Black phenomenon for music that catches on. There's, of course, the Black Wall Street and the Tulsa riots, Klan problems as it resurges, as white people feel a threat to this kind of new interest in Black culture that emerges. So that's all through the 1920s. That brings us then to, notice I didn't leave the screen because I knew I'd be coming back here pretty soon. All right, the 1930s, 1930s, Great Depression, World War II, and here we've got the Great Depression happening, Black Americans being last hired, first fired, lynching issue, which Democrats still don't want to deal with because these Democratic presidents, even Franklin Roosevelt, they need their support from the South, and there are just too many white people that are not going to go for things like anti-lynching laws. And so that joins the discussion. FDR's informal Black cabinet that he kind of informally listens to. His wife Eleanor is a big part of all of this, but at the same time, slow to move on civil rights, in effect, because of the need for racist Democratic support out of the South. and that's through the Great Depression and the New Deal. In the 1940s, again, we've got Black Americans working in factories for the war effort, not getting rewarded for it, getting paid less, serving in segregated units overseas. Of course, there's notably the Tuskegee Airmen, the GI Bill. And while World War II is going on, the promise of the GI Bill that returning veterans will get education benefits and housing, both of which, in theory, open to Black veterans, in practice, not given to them at all, because as you'll see, the development of redlining that is associated with housing after World War II and exclusivity, white flight, okay, in the 1940s and 50s, as white people move out of the cities and then redline off districts where Black people aren't allowed to live. All right, and it's actually in housing contracts and stuff like that. This is all part of our discussion here and the defining of this country after World War II. And we really get into de facto versus de jure segregation, segregation by law versus segregation by fact. And redlining is kind of a good example of that in the North, as opposed to the outright segregation of the South. The entertainment breakthrough of like Jackie Robinson for sports. And I do talk a little bit about like how that is a good thing, but how that also kind of like serves as a kind of segregation. Like we will let Black people in certain areas of entertainment now, all right, which is a breakthrough and a very limiting factor, particularly when it comes to like professional and college athletics and kind of how that matters down the line. That's part of our discussion. 1950s, white flight, like I said, redlining, rock and roll music as a unique music coming out of the Black community that eventually gets accepted once guys like white guys like Elvis and stuff bring it mainstream, but it increasingly puts Black people out there as entertainers. And again, there are benefits and drawbacks to that. Of course, the initial civil rights movement, we specifically go into Montgomery, Emmett Till incident, Little Rock, Brown v. Board of Education, all that stuff. And at this point, we're in post-World War II modern era. So let me go back to the screen. So this is a big, like, encompassing era, but post-World War II, modern era really encompasses essentially from World War II to today. And we really look at it at that point in my class, we start breaking down by decades, even though we're going extremely fast because, I mean, the AP exam at this point is right around the corner. And so at this time, we start getting in the 1960s and how civil rights starts to become a little more radicalized, the Black Power movement, Martin Luther King. Here are some of the people that I specifically discuss. We look at excerpts of their writings. We look at video segments of them and their voices. Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, personal favorite of mine, Black Power speech that he gives in at UC Berkeley. Right, we actually read that. Take a look at excerpts from it. Malcolm X, the Black Panthers. I discuss about their connection of with Marxism and how like Black Americans are basically the proletariat in the United States and how they really kind of take that up. It's kind of a racialization of Marxist theory. Muhammad Ali and his voice, the Vietnam War, draft issues and racism with regards to the Vietnam War, affirmative action, and the debate that ensues over that. Not to mention the discussion of like the Civil Rights Act, the welfare programs under Lyndon Johnson. By the time we get to the 70s, there's forced busing, especially in the North, the problems that are causing major northern cities over this, as again, whites don't, it's kind of this like, yeah, voting rights, civil rights, that's fine, but don't live next to me kind of attitude that gets exposed by the forced busing of the 1970s. The struggles for Black Americans that still exist economically and in the education system. The play that the religious right and the rise of the religious right, which is by far a white movement that happens in the late 70s and continues into the 1980s, to kind of reinforce a kind of, they would claim a non-racial view, but a lot of it is wrapped around white Christianity, okay? In the late 70s and in the 80s. And then we get to Reagan, his cutting of social programs, dog whistle politics, effects of trickle-down economics, the negative effects on, particularly on Black Americans, the development of hip-hop music that comes out of this kind of desire to express what things are like in the inner cities in these areas as a result of a lot of these white policies that are being put into place. And by the time we get to the 90s, we're still talking economics and educational setbacks. And into the 2000s, we're wrapping things up quickly at this point in my course, but the rise of the Tea Party as an opposition to the Obama presidency, which has obvious racist undertones to it, all the way to the Trump election in 2016 and the dog whistle politics, the racism involved in that as well. So, this gives you a sense of just some of the things that I teach in AP US history without getting into the gritty details of like the actual docs I use and stuff, to try and give you an idea that in AP US history, for myself, we definitely include this voice, the voice of Black Americans, right? That I haven't even gotten into what I do with Native Americans and women and immigrants and all of the others that need to be included in a course of this magnitude as a survey. It's a challenge, okay? But it's something that we really believe in. And so that gives you a sense for AP US history. Thanks for taking the time.